This lecture covers quite a few important details regarding shares and share certificates, so it's not going to be very short like my other lectures, but since it includes very important details, I'd advise you to listen through the entire lecture. Okay, first with the simple basics, a share certificate can either be in a physical form or it can be in an electronic form, which is basically known as book entry form. Another important point is that every share is distinguished by another share through the basis of a distinct number, that is, every share is going to be carrying a distinctive number. The third point is that a share has to be paid for in full. Remember that previously it was possible to pay partly for a share even before you get the share allotted in your name, but now this is no longer possible. That is, you have to pay for the share in full in order to get the share allotted in your name, that is, in the name of the shareholder. So in short, partly paid shares are no longer possible under the new regime of the Companies Act 2017. Other than these basics, there's also the fact that shares are obviously a form of property. So like property, they are transferable from one person to another. And of course, this also means that a shareholder is going to be subject not only to rights but also to certain legal obligations. But I'm not going to go into the details of that for now. Moving on to the next point that I want to discuss. So the legal nature of a share needs to be clearly understood and appreciated. And this point links back to the decision in the case of Makora, which I have discussed in another lecture. And in that lecture, I did mention that it's important to understand the legal nature of a share in order to appreciate that decision. So take note of the fact that this particular point is definitely related to that particular case. So we're already aware of the fact that the word shareholder is usually meant to imply that a shareholder owns a share of the company. And this is basically how we use this term in everyday language. And this is correct to a certain extent. Why? Because a shareholder does indeed own, for example, a share of the participation rights in the company through the right to vote, for instance, and the right to attend meetings, and the right to participate in a dividend, and so on and so forth. So in all of these ways, definitely a shareholder does own a share of certain rights in the company. But after listening to the lecture on Makora's case, hopefully you're clear about the fact that shareholders do not in any way or in any sense own a share of the company's property. So in the legal sense, actually, truly speaking, nobody really owns the company, because the company owns its own assets since it's a separate legal entity. And hopefully you can now see that owning a share legally simply entitles you to certain participation rights in the company as a member and as a shareholder. But just because you have shares in the company does not give you any sort of rights over the property or the assets of the company. So in short, what rights do you exactly have as a shareholder and as a member? Well, like I mentioned earlier, you're entitled to information, you're entitled to participate in the company, and of course you're entitled to attend the meetings, and you have rights to vote as well as to receive dividends. But that too only if dividends are declared. So with this short discussion, I wanted to make sure that you're clear about the legal nature of a share and the rights that holding a share give rise to. And in short, before I move on, like I always do, let me just highlight the key take-home message. So the key point here is that a share is in no way a representation of the fractional value of the company's property. Therefore, if somebody holds 10% of the shares of the company, that doesn't mean that they have a right over 10% of the company's property. Because the company is a separate legal entity and it is capable of owning its own property, and like I said earlier, there is no legal connection between a share in the company and a share in the company's property. And this is so regardless of the fact that there could be a situation, as in the case of Makora, where one person holds all of the shares in the company. Okay, so now that we're clear about this very basic point, there is another extremely important point that you need to know about the legal nature of a share. And this point is related to the topic of debentures, which I have discussed in other videos. So if you don't already know what a debenture is, then it should be helpful to first look at those lectures. But the point that I want to explain right now is that by holding shares in a company, a shareholder acquires rights in the company and not simply against the company. So the reason I just mentioned debentures is because a debenture holder holds rights against the company and not in the company. So like I said earlier a little while ago, that a shareholder will, for example, have financial rights such as the right to share in the dividend distributions. And in case the company is wound up, that is in the case of winding up, they are also entitled to any return of capital. And other than winding up, while the company is up and running, then during that time the shareholders are entitled to participative rights such as voting at general meetings. So the point of sharing these examples is to help you understand that a share therefore has various legal attributes which confer both property as well as contractual rights on the holder of the share. So the shareholder basically gets certain legal rights through that share. So to put it in other words, by virtue of holding a share in a company, you get certain rights in the company. Like I said earlier, a share gives you rights in the company. And I just gave you so many examples of how you get rights in the company. For example, to mention just one point again, participative rights and so on and so forth. So hopefully these examples have made it clear what I meant to say when I said that a shareholder acquires rights in the company and not simply against the company. Now, on the other hand, if you understand what a debenture is, then you would know that a debenture holder holds rights against the company and not in the company. So a debenture holder does not enjoy any of the rights that I just mentioned. And at this point, I'm going to take the liberty to take you on a little detour to remind you of what a debenture basically is. So in short, a debenture is simply a document that creates or evidences a debt. So it's basically a written acknowledgement of a debt. And in case you're interested in further details, then you can listen to my other lecture where I discussed the case of Salomon, because in that case the concept of a debenture was important. So I've discussed this particular concept at length in that lecture. That is the lecture where I explained the facts of the case of Salomon. And there's another lecture which is a short one where I discuss only the concept of a debenture and talk in more detail about a fixed charge and a floating charge. So do listen to that other lecture if you're interested. Now coming back to our topic for this lecture, what I simply wanted you to understand is that the way a debenture operates is that if in case the company fails to pay the money back as agreed, then the bank can simply take the relevant property or assets of the company over which the debenture has been created. So the debenture is basically created against certain assets of the company, and in case the company fails to pay the money back, then the bank is not going to be remaining empty-handed. Basically the bank can simply take over that particular asset, sell it off and use that money to pay off the debt. And this was, by the way, a very simplified explanation, but I hope you got the point. And these assets can of course be anything. It could be the property of the company or, for example, the machinery of the company. To conclude this lecture, the point is that shareholders do not have rights against the company in the same way that debenture holders do, because the debenture holder has contractual rights against the company and not in the company. So if the transaction, since it's secured because the debenture holder has rights to sell off the relevant assets or the relevant property, so you should be able to see that this also creates a right in the company's property for the debenture holder. And this is a right, I repeat, that the shareholders do not have, but it's only debenture holders who have this right. And once again, please refer to that other video where I discussed this in detail, because the main topic for this video was to appreciate the fact that shareholders have rights in the company and not against the company. And the only reason I started discussing the concept of a debenture and the rights of debenture holders is because I wanted you to appreciate and understand this important point. And since this lecture is already quite long, so I'm going to discuss the differences between ordinary and preference shareholders in the next lecture.